Middle Eastern Crusades are pretty well known, but not so well known are what are termed the Northern Crusades, directed by the Church against the non-Christian people bordering the Baltic Sea during the Middle Ages. Now, these were just as, if not more violent than their Middle Eastern counterparts, and certainly lasted longer, with warfare being almost continuous from the 10th to the 15th century. Death or baptism, that was the uncompromising battle cry of St. Bernard of Clairvaux in the mid-12th century, the man who was instrumental in preaching war against these pagan people. And in fact, the Pope at the time, Eugenius III, also took just as hardline a stance as St. Bernard. So a pretty determined attitude by the Church to eliminate the pagan beliefs and customs of the people in this area and force them into Christianity. But the Baltic Sea pagans had no interest in converting and were determined to maintain their beliefs and culture, even with almost continuing violence over several centuries by the Christians to their west. Quote, "They preferred to die rather than to become Christian or to pay tribute to the Saxon dukes," wrote Helmold of Bozo, a 12th century chronicler. And even when they were forced under threat of death to convert, the conversion was usually nominal. Bishop Burchard of the imperial city of Worms in Germany in the 11th century pretty much summed up the problems the Christian church was having and would have in the future as well for quite some time to increase its domain in these areas. Quote, "It is in the order of things that even those who were brought over to the faith by means of violence or compulsion have to be forced to remain faithful," he would write. After the Wendish Crusade, pagan practices would be banned completely on pain of death. Gonzalin, the Count of Schwerin, for example, close to the end of the 12th century, would order death by hanging of any armed pagan Slav found in the territory, with only convert slaves being allowed to live. So a long but fascinating story running through several centuries of heavy compulsion by the Christian church and equally tough resistance to conversion by the Baltic people. And in this second video in this series on the Northern Crusades, we'll take a detailed look at the very first Northern Crusade. This crusade was against the Wends, a Slavic race of people who lived immediately adjacent to the borders of Christendom at that time in what is now northeast Germany. Therefore, the First Northern Crusade is alternatively called the Wendish Crusade, and we'll find out who these Wendish people were, who were the Crusaders, why they attacked the Wends, and what happened and how these particular pagan Slav communities of northern Germany were defeated and pretty much disappeared over time as German settlers moved in on conquered territory and either assimilated or wiped out these communities. By the way, if you'd like to watch an introduction to the Northern Crusades, and which includes a quick summary on the Wendish Crusade, the link is on the top right of the picture. And if you'd like to skip to any particular section in this video, the chapter links are in the description below. This is actually the first of a three-part series on the Wendish Crusade. This one covers the build-up to the crusade and the reasons for the conflict. Part 2 covers the actual crusade itself in the year 1147 CE. And Part 3 covers the conquest of the island of Rugia off the German coast, which was the last stronghold of Slavic paganism in what is now present-day Germany and which fell in the year 1168. After that, the only openly pagan areas remaining would be the Prussians and the Baltic people further east along the Baltic Sea coast and to the north, and we'll cover those in future episodes. So before we get into the subject proper, let's quickly go through a brief overview of when and where the Wendish Crusade took place, just to put it in context with the other more well-known Middle Eastern Crusades. So as you can see from the table, it was carried out at the same time and in parallel with the more mainstream Second Crusade being directed at the Middle East. And that was around 50 years after the First Crusade laid the foundations for these kind of large-scale religious wars. And in fact, it was triggered off for the same reason as the Second Crusade as well. And that was an event that occurred far away in the Middle East, the fall of the Crusader stronghold of the city of Edessa to the Seljuk Turks, which we'll go into shortly. Both crusades being organised at the same time, European Christians were given the option by the Pope of going either to the Middle East to fight the Muslims or to fight the pagans in Eastern Europe much closer to home. The spiritual rewards offered were exactly the same. The Pope promised absolution of all sins and therefore a straight ticket to the Christian heaven for anyone joining the fight against non-believers, be they pagans or Muslims. And this meant that all kinds of people, German Saxons primarily, but also Danes and Poles, Englishmen and Franks, Frisians and Bohemians, and various other nationalities who weren't too keen on trekking all the way to the Middle East could now stay much closer to home and join in the action against the Baltic pagans. Wendish Crusade, as briefly mentioned earlier, could actually be split into two sections. The first crusade proper took place in 1147 on the European mainland. A multi-pronged and numerically superior Christian attack was launched across the River Elbe against the Wends, but the Wendish pagan leader, Prince Nyklot, a pretty intelligent and resourceful leader as it turned out, put up a stiff and very organised resistance against the Christian invasion. Because of this, the Wendish Crusade was considered a failure militarily, as the Christian armies involved struggled to defeat the pagans decisively. Neither did they manage to force Christianity immediately on these people or destroy their temples and holy groves. However, the crusade did weaken the Wends sufficiently for them to come under Christian dominance permanently, and the process of forced conversion of these unwilling people would take several decades to complete in the aftermath of the crusade, and we'll cover the story in part 2 of the video. The second conflict against the Wends took place around 20 years later in 1168, when the last stronghold of the pagan Wends, the island of Rugia off the German coast, whose people had not been defeated yet, were attacked by the Danes. The famous temple dedicated to the god Swantewit in the city of Arkona, a place of pilgrimage for people all across northern Europe, was destroyed along with all the other remaining temples on the island, and churches were constructed in their place. So this second half of the crusade was much more successful. The conquest of Rugia effectively signalled the end of indigenous belief in what is now Germany, although in the Wendish villages and towns, many people would still go on worshipping the Slavic pagan beliefs in secret for some time, despite the destruction of their shrines and the banning of their religious traditions. And that story will be covered in part 3 of this video. So let's start by having a closer look at the territory that belonged to the Wends. To understand the ethnically Slavic population of the Baltic region in the 12th century, you could quite easily split up the southern Baltic into separate regions divided by the major rivers of that area. From north to south, Christian Saxon control ended at what were called the Saxon limes. These were essentially undefended dikes built to mark the border with the Slavic Wends. These were built during Charlemagne's time and marked the furthest limits of Frankish expansion during his reign. Further south of these limes, Saxon control ran all along the left bank of the Elbe River and then the left bank of the River Saal, a tributary of the Elbe. Now, ever since Charlemagne's time, the border of Christendom had stayed at the Elbe River. And the reason for this was that the Saxons, formerly pagans but now committed Christians by this time, were involved in their own wars, wranglings and politics, and therefore unable to advance and conquer the territories to the east of them permanently, although they did consistently make numerous forays across the river and begin the subjection of the Wends, as we'll see later. Across the other side of the Elbe and running all the way through what is now Poland and into Russia was the territory of the various Slavic nations. These people, different stock from the Germanic tribes, had moved into these areas after the Germanic tribes had moved across the Elbe and Rhine and into southern and western Europe during and after the fall of the Roman Empire. In the land between the Elbe and the Oder, 300 kilometres further to the east, in other words, the area which is now the northeastern section of modern-day Germany, was the territory of various pagan groups and tribes, collectively called the Wends or Wendish people. The Wends were, as you can see, the most westerly of the Slavic people who, by this time, occupied most of Eastern Europe. These people had been targeted by Saxon and other missionaries ever since the Saxons had been converted, but were resisting efforts to Christianize them quite strongly. Another 300 kilometres or so further east of the Oder was another major river, the Vistula. Between the Oder and the Vistula was the territory of the Pomeranians, meaning literally dwellers on the shore. These were also non-Christian pagan people who were also being targeted by missionaries from Poland, Saxony and elsewhere. And further east along the Baltic coast, from the Vistula to the Niemen River, lived the Prussians, also committed pagans, and still further on the eastern shores of the Baltic came the Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians. None of these people were Christians either. So, coming back to the Wends, the name itself went back quite a long time. These people were called the Wendi in Latin, so this name given to them might well perhaps go as far back as Roman times. The German Saxons across the border called these people Wenden, and the Danes and Scandinavians called them Vinder in their skaldic poetry. It's difficult to get an accurate picture of the Wends, as most of the sources we have are written by Christian clerics who had a vested interest in showing the pagan Wends as barbaric and uncivilized heathens. Adam of Bremen, the well-known 11th century chronicler, described the Wends as a confederation of around 13 or so major tribes, and which had a lot of social coherence amongst themselves, being of the same culture and language. And here's a list in case anyone really wants to go into the details. But I'll just mention the 4 or 5 main Wendish tribes that the Crusaders would fight against. First were the Wagrians, who were the people in the north living close to the border with Denmark. They lived between the Trave River and the River Elbe, and therefore right next to the Christian Saxons. To their east, from the Trave to the Warnow River, were the Abatrites, and then you had the Palabian people to the south of the Abatrites. Finally, there were the Lutetians to their east, from Warnow and Rugen Island to the Oder River, and lastly the Sorbs to the south. So these were some of the more prominent of the Wendish nations. As regards their character, many of the Christian chroniclers of that time, begrudgingly or not, wrote pretty complimentary descriptions about these people and their qualities. Adam of Bremen, for example, writes that, quote, one cannot find a more honourable or more hospitable people than the Slavs. And Herbordus, another historian, writes of the complete lack of theft and the exceptional hospitality they showed to strangers. Quote, so great are the trust and confidence which prevail amongst the people that they have no experience of theft or fraud, and possess no boxes or locked cases. We never witnessed a lock or a key, and they were themselves astonished to see our pack saddles and our locked cases. Their clothes, their money, and all their precious things they store in cases and large, barely covered jugs, for they fear no mischief and have never had such an experience. It is wondrous to note that their tables are never cleared or left without food, but each head of a family has a house which is clean and suitable for a man to refresh himself. The table within it is never without food and drink, and when that which is provided is consumed, more is supplied. No dirt or uncleanness is allowed, but the dishes are covered with clean napkins and are ready for those who desire to eat. At whatever hour any desire to obtain refreshment, whether they are guests or members of the family, when they come, they find everything at the table ready. And Helmold of Bozo also wrote on similar lines regarding their hospitality. Quote, there I learned from experience what before I knew by report, that no people are more distinguished in its regard for hospitality than the Slavs. For in respect of the entertainment of guests, they are all, as if of one mind, eager that it be not necessary for anyone to ask for hospitality. Whatever they obtain by farming, fishing, or hunting, they bestow with wholehearted generosity, considering the one who is most liberal as the most manful. And these compliments extended to the fighting ability of the people as well, and that the reason for their downfall against the Christians as well. Quote, in general, the Slavs are brave and aggressive men, and if not their disunion on account of their splitting into numerous branches and tribal dispersion, no nation in the world could equal them in power. They inhabit countries very rich in dwellings and in provisions. They are diligent in agriculture and in other industries, and in this they surpass all nations on the north. Their wares by land and sea reach the Rus and Constantinople. And as you can see from the map, the Wends had a fair number of cities within their territory, each complete with numerous temples to their deities. The city of Rethra in the Palabian territory was the most important religious centre and had a large temple dedicated to the god Radigost, who was one of the principal deities in the Slavic pantheon. We don't know exactly where Rethra was, as the temple and town were completely destroyed by the Crusaders, but the consensus seems to be that the town was situated close to the Leaps and Talents lakes near Neubrandenburg. The town was pretty important, and many of the major decisions of the Wendish leaders were traditionally made here. Examples are the decision to begin the Great Slav Revolt of 983 against their Christian overlords, which we'll talk about shortly. And in 1066, another revolt against the Saxons was celebrated in Rethra, and a Christian bishop was decapitated in revenge and his head stuck on a pole and offered to the deity Radigost. So the city of Rethra could really be considered the equivalent of Jerusalem to the pagan Wends. Another city arguably as famous was Arkona to the north on the island of Rugia, which belonged to the Rani people. Now, this was an international pilgrimage site as well at the time, the city having a fabulous temple dedicated to the god Swantowit, and which attracted many people from all over the Baltic area. Meanwhile, the Pomeranians, the people to the east of the Wends, before they were converted, also had their holy sites in the big cities. For example, at Wallin and Stettin on the border with the Wends. Here there was a large temple on a hill dedicated to the famous god Triglav. And all these cities attracted a lot of pilgrims from afar to their temples. So quite an energetic and vigorous Baltic religious culture could be found well into the 12th century. Sticking with their religious affiliation, the salient point as far as the Christians across the Elbe were concerned was their loyalty to their Slavic deities. The Slavs in general, whether it was the Wends, Pomeranians, Prussians, or the Balts, had little interest in Christianity. In fact, many had a deep hatred of the religion. To them, Christ was a foreign god of their enemies, and they referred to the Christian god as Teutonicus Deus, meaning the god of the Germans. Herodotus, the 12th century writer, records the typical attitude of the pagan Pomeranians, for example, when confronted by Christian missionaries who were asking them to convert. Quote, "What should we do with you? We will not abandon the laws of our fathers, and we are content with the religion that we possess. Amongst the Christians there are thieves and robbers, and for those who, for their crimes, have been deprived of feet and eyes. All sorts of crimes and penalties are found amongst them, and Christian curses another Christian. Let such a religion be far from us." And the Wendish people could clearly recognise the dangers an aggressive Christianity posed to their culture and traditions. Some of the Wendish and Pomeranian cities put restrictions on Christian missionary activity, knowing the consequences of untrammelled mass missionary attempts that could be harnessed by the church and to which the pagans would have no answer to in terms of money or manpower. Adam of Bremen, for example, tells us of the city of Jumneh, one of the biggest of the pagan cities, where Saxons could not advertise their beliefs openly. Quote, "Jumneh is truly one of the largest cities in Europe. The Slavs and other ethnicities, Greeks and barbarians, live in Jumneh. For the Saxon travellers to gain admission into the city and stay there with equal rights as all others, the condition is for them not to publicly profess their Christian faith. They are, to wit, still under the influence of their pagan rites and delusions, but nowhere can one find a more honourable and more hospitable people." And rules such as this in this city and other towns and cities help to keep Christianity at bay. Similar situations could be found all along the Baltic coast. The Prussians, for instance, also kept care against Christian expansion, killing missionaries who tried to change their ways. Quote, "Many praiseworthy things could be said about this people with respect to their morals, if only they had the faith of Christ, whose missionaries they cruelly persecute. At their hands, Adalbert, the illustrious Bishop of Bohemia, received the crown of martyrdom. Although they share everything else with our people, they prohibit only to this very day access to their groves and springs, which they aver are polluted by the entry of Christians. Living, moreover, in inaccessible swamps, they will not endure a master among them." Unquote. Again, Helmhold here hints at their eventual downfall due to their reluctance to work under a leader for much of the time, their attitudes being entirely republican. And this was something the Christian leaders did not have to face, as Saxon kings, dukes, counts, and margraves could count on their authority and lead armies into Slavic lands without any fear of being challenged by their own people. So let's move on to their neighbours. Surrounding the Wends by the 12th century were the various Christianised nations and peoples, some of them having been converted relatively recently. As mentioned, there were the German Saxons across the River Elbe to the west. To the north were the Danes from nearby Denmark. The Danes had been converted in the late 10th century. And then to the east and south of the Wends were the Poles, who, although Slavic by race, had also been converted at the end of the 10th century. By the middle of the 12th century, the Pomeranian peoples had been given an ultimatum by the Polish king to convert or face a large-scale invasion, and they had succumbed to the pressure and had converted. And what this would mean was that the Wendish people, by the time of the Wendish Crusade, would be effectively isolated, being surrounded on all sides by Christian nations, and were therefore pretty vulnerable to an organised attack from several directions. Generally, the pagans, being, quote, heathens, unquote, were looked down upon by their Christian neighbours, and this was the case even during early Frankish times, 500 years prior to the Crusade. A good example we have record of was the conversation between a Frankish envoy by the name of Sicarius and a Slavic king called Samo around 630 CE, and written down by the 7th century Frankish chronicler Friedgar. The Frankish envoy, he writes, asked for compensation for merchants who'd been captured or killed by Slavic people. The Slavic king didn't show much interest, and not receiving much help, the envoy showed his true feelings. He, quote, roared out to Samo that he and his people would be made slaves, in other words, to the Franks, and that, quote, it is not possible that Christians, God's servants, should become friendly with dogs, unquote. Samo, though, responded with an equally cutting reply before throwing out the envoy and ordering him back to his own land. Quote, then if you are God's servants, we are his hounds, and since you persist in offending him, we are within our rights to tear you to pieces, unquote. Many of the later clerics, too, generally wrote in deprecating terms about the Slavs. A chap called Sturmy, who was a disciple of the 8th century St. Boniface, commented on a tribe of Slavs that Boniface passed by as they bathed in a river. Quote, his beast, fearing these naked bodies, began to tremble, and the man of God himself loathed the stench that proceeded from them, meaning the pagan Slavs. And of course, the pagan deities that the Wends believed in were considered demons allied with the devil himself. Helmold of Beauzot, the 12th century historian, would write that the church sent bishops into a land of want and hunger where Satan had fixed his residence, followed by every foul spirit, unquote. And typically, Christians of that time used the word God interchangeably with demon or devil, essentially thinking of pagan deities as Satan himself. Adam of Bremen, for example, described the temple in Rethra in the following fashion. Quote, right in the middle of the most powerful of them all, the Rithari, whose capital city of Rethra is the centre of pagan worship. A large temple to the demons is built in Rethra, the most important of them being Redigost. His statue is made of gold and his temple is adorned in purple, unquote. And apostates were typically explained away as the devil's work. Quote, the two towns of Julian and Stettin apostatized at the instigation of the great enemy and abandoned the worship of the true God, and by observing again their idolatrous customs gave themselves over to destruction, unquote. In terms of geography, the entire Slavic populated Eastern Europe was generally referred to as Slavia or Slovenia, and this is the name that authors like Adam of Bremen use in their narrative. And the Baltic Sea itself was called the Barbarian Sea, or also the Scythian Sea, in reference to the pagan people living around its periphery. So, as you can see, there was not just a racial and cultural divide between the Franks, Danes, and Saxons on one side and the Slavs on the other, separated only by the Elbe River, but an all important and very strong religious divide as well, including a strong feeling of contempt on the Christian side for the pagan Slavs and their beliefs. By the way, it can take quite some time to plan and create these videos, so if you do like these kind of videos and you'd like to help the channel, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit the like and subscribe buttons. And if you'd like to go a step further, the channel does have a Patreon account as well as other ways for one-off donations. Any help is greatly appreciated. So let's get into why the crusade against the Wends occurred in the first place. Well, there was a huge number of factors, events, politics, and military actions that were at play prior to the crusade, but the background reasons could really be summed up into three main points. The first was the independence of the Saxons from Frankish rule and their subsequent rise as a military power. And the easiest way that the Saxons could engage in territorial expansion was eastwards into the less densely populated lands of East Europe. And in fact, German expansion would, due to the Northern Crusades, gradually extend all the way to the East Baltic, with the territories of Latvia and Estonia coming under German control later as well. And it would be German expansion to the east that would ultimately end Wendish independence. Secondly, and just as importantly, was the Church's own ambitions and ongoing advance eastwards into Slavic lands, and this went hand in hand with territorial conquest. The missionary zeal of the Church was intense and uncompromising, and the pressure and the military force on the Slavs exerted by the Church through Christian Saxon, Danish, and other rulers to convert was quite considerable, as we'll find out. Saying no to conversion was not really an option once you were militarily defeated, and the subjugated people, be they Wends, Prussians, or Balts, could be said to be effectively under the control of the Church, as the conquered country was split up into church dioceses ready to be digested. The third reason could be said to be a product of the first two, with Christian Europeans from the 10th century onwards migrating into less populated Eastern Europe in large numbers and annexing land after Saxon armies defeated Slavic people. And you could compare this mass movement to European migration to the American continent in the 16th to 19th centuries, with the locals being displaced by the foreign influx, and there was no guilt associated with the seizure of land because the Slavs were pagans. You could even call it a medieval form of manifest destiny, which was the idea developed by 19th century Europeans that they had a divine right to the land on the American continent. So let's examine the territorial advance of the Saxons eastwards and the associated supremacy of the church that went with it in conquered areas. Before the 9th century, the Wends were pretty much left alone, not being adjacent to the borders of Christendom. At that time, it was the Saxons who were pagans at the time, who were the closest to the Christian Franks and formed the buffer zone between the Wends and the Frankish Empire. The Saxons at this stage were in fact now the last remaining Germanic people who had not accepted Christianity. Interestingly, the Wends during the early 9th century were actually allies of the Franks, even though the Frankish emperor Charlemagne was zealously Christian and very anti-pagan. The reason for this alliance was because they had a common enemy in the Saxons, and an alliance between the two therefore seemed pretty natural. And so between 772 and 804 CE, a period of 32 years, Charlemagne waged almost constant war against the Saxons, while the Wends, as his allies, kept them occupied to the east. These Frankish wars were both for conquest of territory and for the conversion of the Saxons. And in fact, Charlemagne was quite open to the use of force and terror to achieve these goals. And these wars culminated in the massacre at Verdun in the year 782 CE, when around 4,500 Saxon warriors were killed in order to overawe their people into submission. The author of the 8th century work, the Paderborn Epic, mentions the use of terror and war by the Franks to convert the pagan Saxons and suggests the end justified the means in the matter of conversion. Quote, "What the contrary mind and perverse soul refuse to do with persuasion, let them leap to accomplish when compelled by fear," unquote. So what did the Saxon wars have to do with the Wends? Well, this alliance with the Christian Franks may have been wise in the short run, but had its dangers in the long run. Perhaps a better alliance would have been to help the pagan Saxons instead. Whatever the case, what this meant was that the Saxons, after they had been defeated and forcibly converted by the Franks, retained their animosity towards the Wendish people, and the defeat of the Saxons also now meant the borders of Christianity had expanded right up to the Elbe and Saale rivers. Wendish lands were now adjacent to Christian Europe, and this meant that they were next in the firing line. And over time, the Saxons would become independent as Charlemagne's Frankish Empire splintered into fragments in 843 CE, with the area between the Rhine and the Elbe becoming what was known as East Francia before splintering even further into various German duchies. Although the Saxons waged intermittent war against the Wends during this time, the fractured state of East Francia and internal wars and politics meant the Wends were never under serious pressure. But all this changed in the early 10th century, and this was because a chap called Henry the Fowler, the Duke of Saxony, would become King of East Francia in 919 CE. He would be the first of a new dynasty, a Saxon dynasty, as opposed to a Frankish one. And his empire would evolve into what would become the medieval state of Germany, but first these separate states would evolve into a loose confederation known as the Holy Roman Empire. Henry the Fowler would be succeeded by Otto I, or Otto the Great, who would further expand and consolidate the nascent German state. The Saxons, much more powerful now and committed Christians by this time, were now ready to begin expanding to their east. And this expansion began in earnest in the year 929 CE. Henry the Fowler's Saxon army, led by Count Bernard, crossed the Elbe River in that year. On the 4th of September 929, the Slavs were defeated quite decisively at the important Battle of Lenzen near the city of Brandenburg. And Henry showed no mercy after the battle, ordering the execution of all the Slav prisoners taken at the battle. 3 years after Lenzen, in the year 932, Henry the Fowler defeated the Lusatians as well. One of the conditions he imposed on them if they wanted friendly relations was their conversion to Christianity. The Wends, though, would balk at this, and they were largely successful in continuing their traditional beliefs. Even before the victory at Lenzen, sometime during the 1120s, Henry the Fowler had created a new march consisting of essentially the entire Wendish territory, and this indicated the expansionist policy the Germans had adopted. Marches were border estates, in other words half-conquered territories which had not been entirely pacified. Governors were chosen for these estates who were given the titles of margraves, and it was the task of the margraves to collect tribute from the people in these territories and to overcome any rebellion, revolts, or other disturbances they may instigate. And there were various other marches consisting of newly conquered territories along the peripheries of German control in the east as well, as you can see from this map. The march that consisted of Wendish lands would be named Marcha Gironis, or the March of Giro, after Count Giro, the second governor of the territory, and would encompass the entire territory from the Elbe to the River Oder. Giro, the governor, was apparently a pretty cruel man and waged war frequently against the Wends to pacify the march and exacted large tributes from them at the same time. He's famous for inviting 30 of the conquered Slavic chiefs of his time to a banquet on the pretense of talking peace, in which all but one were murdered, with one managing to escape quite by accident. In fact, the Wends would raise their battle standards again under a leader called Stoinev. And Otto, the son of Henry the Fowler, and who would be the future emperor, and Count Giro, would be sent to suppress the rebellion. And on the 16th of October 955, at the Battle of the Raxa River, or alternatively Battle of Racknitz, the Saxons won another decisive victory near Mecklenburg. And to overawe the Wends, Otto organised a severe punishment. The Wendish commander Stoinev died during his escape after the battle, but his body was recovered and Otto had his head impaled on a pole and displayed on the battlefield. And in front of his severed head, 700 prisoners were slaughtered. The Wendish commander's deputy was then brought forward, and he was blinded and his tongue cut out, and he was left for dead amongst a mountain of corpses. Now, these actions hardly endeared the Wends to their Saxon overlords, although there was a crumb of comfort as Giro was killed in fighting against them, as Wittekind of Corvey wrote. Quote, at that time also Count Giro completely conquered the Slavs, who are called Lasiki, and forced them to the lowest condition of servitude, but not without receiving a severe wound himself, and not without the death of that very great man, his nephew, as well as several other very noble men, unquote. What the loss at Lenzen and later at Racknitz meant was that most of the Wendish lands now lay open to Saxon control. And following that defeat, the Palabians, the Abatrites and Wagrians, as well as other Wendish tribes, had to accept the supremacy of the Saxons. And this meant that they had to pay a heavy annual tribute to the Saxon king. On top of this tribute, the pagans also know how to pay the obligatory extra tax or tithe to the church, which, as the name suggests, was 10% of their produce, and which Christians in Christian Europe were obliged to also pay. This church tax became known as the, quote, Slav tithe, unquote. And this tithe of money was channeled to the Christian church bishoprics of places like Magdeburg and Bremen, and strengthening church funds and the church in Germany in general, as well as providing money for Christian missions to convert the Slavs in turn. Over time, the March of Giro was found to be too large and unwieldy to be governed by a single margrave, and on the death of Giro in 965, Otto I, who had succeeded his father by this time, divided the territory into 6 or more smaller marches, each with its own governor or margrave. And from the north to the south, these were the Billinger Mark, the Nordmark, Mark Lausitz, Mark Merseburg, Mark Meissen, and Mark Leitz. The church, meanwhile, was also taking advantage of the victories against the Wends. Before the Battle of Lenzen, the Saxon cities on or near the Elbe formed the border outposts with the Wends, and the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen had been the most important outpost in the 9th century for missionary work amongst the Slavic nations. After Lenzen, though, the church attempted a systematic process of converting the Wends and began establishing new bishoprics in Wendish lands. Oldenburg, known as Stargard by the Wends, was the first to be founded, followed by Havelberg in 946, Brandenburg in 948, Merseburg in 967, and Meissen and Zeitz in 968. Havelberg and Brandenburg were essentially now the new main advance posts for missionary activity against the Slavs. And in 968, the bishopric of Magdeburg was also formed, and this centre was specifically to train missionaries to convert the Wendish people. Magdeburg, in fact, now quickly became the most important bishopric in Slav territory. These Christian settlements in Wendish territories were half churches and half fortresses, as the Saxons knew full well the Wends had no liking for these constructions. And these semi-fortresses were supplied with Saxon garrisons. And with these new churches began intense missionary efforts to convert the defeated Slavs. But despite these efforts by the church authorities, and even with the help of the Saxon army, relatively few converts were forthcoming. The Wendish population was found to be strongly committed to their own culture and beliefs, and largely disinterested in converting to some foreign religion. So these extensive efforts were mostly abortive and largely fruitless, with the church having precious little to show for their efforts in 3 decades. Christian life, to put it bluntly, had little in common with Slavic pagan culture, and conversion essentially took away a whole mode of life. In the Life of Otto of Bamberg, the author states that the Wends now had to keep the Sabbath on a Sunday from now on, with all work stopped, an alien concept to the Slavs. Fasting on Fridays also became obligatory, again an alien belief, and even deaths were affected, and funerals had to be henceforth held with Christian ceremonies in Christian cemeteries rather than cremation or burial in the woods as the pagans did. Visiting soothsayers was banned, and perhaps most tellingly, eating and drinking with pagans was forbidden. So, if one member of a family decided to convert, he could essentially keep no normal relations with his relatives. Pagan temples were torn down and churches built in their exact location, which did little for harmony as well. Now, these kind of measures and social engineering, not to mention the heavy Saxon taxation, naturally created a lot of anger, and subduing the Wends wasn't easy, as Widukind of Corvey described. Quote, but still they preferred war to peace, prizing every misfortune as less dear than their liberty. For they were a race of men that is hardy and patient of labour, accustomed to the most meagre diet, and what was usually a great burden for our soldiers, the Slavs took a certain pleasure in, unquote. Efforts to subdue the Wends came to an abrupt halt in 983, around 50 years after the Battle of Lenzen, when the Wends began a large-scale rebellion, both to overthrow their Saxon rulers and to stop the imposition of Christianity. And this would in fact be the first of 3 major Wendish uprisings, or apostasies as Adam of Bremen described them. The trigger for the uprising was possibly the insult offered to a pagan chief who was called a dog, as Saxons frequently called Slavs. The Wendish chief was a man called Mistivoy. Mistivoy had, as a vassal of the Saxons, given the Duke of Saxony service in Italy along with his men. But he had been insulted by the Saxon Margrave Dietrich, who ruled over the Nordmark March. And Mistivoy had wanted to marry the niece of Duke Bernhard of Saxony, in other words, a Christian. However, Count Dietrich put an end to this possible match, declaring that the woman could not be given to a dog, meaning a pagan Slav. And naturally, Mistivoy, when he heard of this, was angered by this gross insult. Quote, it is only right that the high-born niece of a great prince should be married to a man of exalted rank, and not indeed be given to a dog. The great thanks that are given us for our services, that we are now considered dogs, not men. Well then, if the dog be hell, he will take big bites, unquote. Mistivoy is reputed to have said, according to Helmold of Bozau. The angry chief would return to Rethra and related to his people how he had been called a dog. The Wends, though, had no initial sympathy, since he had volunteered to fight alongside the hated Saxons as a vassal. Helmold describes their response. Quote, but they said, you who spurned your co-tribesmen and courted the Saxons, a perfidious and avaricious race, suffer this deservedly. Swear now to us that you will give thee up, and we will stand by you. And he swore to them, unquote. According to Thietmar of Merseburg, the 11th century chronicler, with the support of his long-suffering people, Mistivoy began the rebellion on the 29th of July at Havelberg, with the Slavs killing the garrison of the city and destroying the cathedral and other Christian churches and chapels. And then they moved on to Brandenburg and Zeitz. Many, if not most, of the newly built churches in Wendish lands were destroyed at this time, and the Christian clergy of Brandenburg and Havelberg, as well as Oldenburg, which were just across the Elbe, had abandoned their churches at this time on news of the uprising and fled back into Christian territory. Those Christian priests who were captured were given a pretty rough time, including torture. Even corpses of Christian priests were dug up, and a famous example was the body of Bishop Dodilo of Brandenburg, which was dug up and desecrated. Such was the fury of the Slavs. Dodilo had in fact been strangled to death, presumably by Slavs 3 years earlier, so the corpse must have been in quite an advanced state of decomposition. In fact, following this uprising, at least one bishop of Meissen in Wendish lands would request, in case of his death, not to be buried on Wendish territory, in case the Slavs redug his body up and treated it like Dodilo's corpse. Needless to say, quite a lot of loot was extracted from the churches, according to Thietmar. Quote, they also stole all the church's treasures and brutally spilled the blood of many. Thus, various cults of demonic heresy were venerated instead of Christ and his fisherman, the Venerable Peter. And not only the heathen praised this sorrowful change, but also Christians, unquote. By Christians, we must presume Thietmar meant Slavs who had only been nominal converts and who apostatized the first chance they got. Now, the Saxons had been taken by surprise and would try and strike back. A strong army under the leadership of the Archbishop of Magdeburg and the Bishop of Halberstadt, consisting of troops of the Margraves of Meissen, Nordmark and Lausitz, would be sent against the Wends, but were defeated near the city of Belkesheim, which is near modern-day Stendal. Following this victory, the Wends gained some respite and returned to their own native beliefs and, of course, stopped paying the Saxon taxes and the church Slav tithe imposed on them. This uprising of 983 actually took place at a pretty good time for the Wends, as the Saxons were busy in their own wars and politics. The Holy Roman Emperor at that time, Otto III, was busy fighting the Hungarians and the Poles, and when he needed assistance, even made alliances with the pagan Lutic people against the Christian Poles, something he would receive heavy criticism for from clerics like the missionary bishop Bruno of Querfurt, who would rebuke the emperor, reminding him how he should be bringing the Lutic to Christianity instead. The uprising of 983 wouldn't be the last. The Saxon armies would return to subjugate the Wends and reimpose the dreaded taxes and church tithes, but the Wends would retaliate and burn down Hamburg in 1011 to 1013. And that was the prelude to the second major uprising, which broke out in 1018 CE. Helmold of Bozell, the Saxon historian and priest of the 12th century, wrote on this uprising. The Slavs, he wrote, again turned their attention to the churches and priests as they gained success against the Saxons. Quote, then roving about the rest of Slavia, they burned all the churches and destroyed them, even to the ground. They murdered the priests and other ministers of the churches with diverse tortures and left not a vestige of Christianity beyond the Elbe. At Hamburg, then and later, many clerics and citizens were led off into captivity, and many more were put to death through hatred of Christianity. The old men of the Slavs tell how Oldenburg had been a city most populous with Christians. There, 60 priests, the rest had been slaughtered like cattle, were kept as objects of derision. The oldest of them, named Odar, and others were martyred in this manner. After the skin of their heads had been cut in the form of a cross, the brain of each was laid bare with an iron. With hands tied behind their backs, the confessors of God were then dragged through one Slavic town after another until they died. Many deeds of this kind, which for lack of written records are now regarded as fables, are remembered as having been done at this time in the several provinces of the Slavs and Nordlbingians. In fine, there were so many martyrs in Slavia that they can hardly be enumerated in a book. All the Slavs who dwelt between the Elbe and the Oder and who had practiced the Christian religion during the whole time of the reign of the Ottos in this manner cut themselves off from the body of Christ and of the church with which they had before been united, unquote. Thus, as Helmod puts it in another place, a country teeming with men and churches was reduced to a vast solitude, unquote. This uprising was crushed with some difficulty, though, and the Saxons would once again impose their rule over these territories. But arguably the largest pagan uprising and the third major one took place in the year 1066. Helmold writes of the continuing lack of success for the church before the revolt, but blamed the uprising on the Saxon aristocracy and their heavy taxation. Quote, in those days there was a firm peace in Slavia because Conrad, who succeeded the pious Henry in the empire, wore down the Wenithi, meaning the Wends, in successive wars. Nevertheless, the Christian religion and the service of the house of God made little headway, since it was hindered by the avarice of the Duke and of the Saxons, who, in their rapacity, let nothing remain, either for the churches or for the priests, unquote. The immediate cause of the 1066 uprising would be the imposition of a Christian convert prince on the Wends. In 1043, the Duke of the Abbatrite people, a man called Gottschalk, later Saint Gottschalk, a Christian, had been prince but had fled to Denmark after losing to a Danish-Saxon coalition force. He would, though, be reinstated as prince by the Danes and Saxons and would try and force his countrymen to convert as well. The Archbishop of Bremen, Adalbert, with whom he had developed a good friendship, would be drafted in to push the conversions along. The bishopric at Oldenburg, or Stargard for the Wagrians, was re-established, as well as Mecklenburg for the Abatrites and Ratzenburg for the Pelagians, with various monasteries built at these places and at Lübeck and Lenzen, amongst other places with various churches built across the territory. But this renewed imposition of Christianity didn't go down well either. There was a rebellion and Gottschalk himself was killed at Lenzen on the 4th of June. What happened during the Slav rebellion to oust Christianity was pretty rough, just like the previous uprisings. Our sources for this rebellion are again Helmold and Adam of Bremen, the 11th century chronicler, and they describe the savagery in good detail. Angry at the church clergy, the locals publicly burned alive a Christian priest called Eppo on his own altar in revenge, and apparently this was also done in other places where churches had been imposed. At Ratzenburg, a monk called Answer was caught and stoned to death on the 15th of July, according to Adam of Bremen. And Helmold writes of another bishop, the first bishop of Mecklenburg, called John, who had come from Ireland to Saxony. John was taken prisoner with other Christians at Mecklenburg and then paraded through the Wendish towns and cities. And on the 10th of November, 1066, he was killed by the Slavs. Quote, because he confessed Christ, he was beaten with rods and then was led in mockery through one city of the Slavs after another. Since he could not be turned from the profession of Christ, his hands and feet were lopped off and his body was thrown into the road. His head, however, the barbarians cut off, fixed on a spear and offered it to their god Redigost at Rethra in token of their victory, unquote. The other Christian clergy were paraded around the towns also and whipped as they walked till they died. And once again, all the bishoprics, churches and cathedrals built in places like Mecklenburg, Ratzeburg, Oldenburg, Lenzen, Schleswig and other places were burnt to the ground. In fact, the Slavs were organised enough to counterattack against the Saxons and penetrated Saxony as far as the city of Hamburg again, which they destroyed, and the pagan army also managed to plunder much of Saxony en route and back. Quote, at that time, Schleswig, the northern Albanian Saxon city, which lies on the border of Denmark and which was as wealthy as it was rich in people, was completely levelled in a sudden pagan attack. Nearly all the nobles were either killed or taken hostage. The castle in Hamburg was completely destroyed, and to mock our saviour, they cut the crosses into pieces. And thus in our lands the prophecy was fulfilled, which says, Lord, the pagans breached your patrimony, befouled your holy temple, together with other things prophesied in the lament over the destruction of Jerusalem. With Christianity ousted again, the Wends went back to their own customs and beliefs, as Helmold described. Quote, and so all the Slavs who were sworn to a general conspiracy lapsed again into paganism after they had killed those who persisted in the faith, and the See of Oldenburg was vacant for 84 years, unquote. The leader of this last rebellion was a very intelligent and resourceful leader from Rugia called Krut or Kruto. Kruto would go on to make a strong defensive position on an island situated on the confluence of the Trave and Waschnitz rivers. The present-day city of Lübeck, founded in 1143, now stands on the same spot. And he managed to keep hostilities going with the Saxons without significant loss to the Wends for some time with the limited resources he had available. Kruto would go on to have a pretty lengthy reign from 1066 to around 1093, and the pagan Slav community was relatively safe during this time, in which Kruto drove out many of the German settlers who had migrated across the Elbe River. But not everything would go his way. The Saxons would recover, and around 2 years later, in 1068 CE, would attack the famous temple of Radigost at Rethra in revenge and completely destroy it. The temple was destroyed by Burchard of Weltheim, a German bishop of Halberstadt. The bishop marched an army in the middle of winter across the frozen countryside, invading the territory of the Latici tribe. The temple treasures were ransacked, and the bishop would ride back on the sacred black horse of the deity, which was kept on the temple lands. Now, what the destruction of the temple at Rethra would mean is that the famous pagan temple at Arkona on the island of Rugia to the north would increase in importance and become the main centre of worship for the Wends from now on. After the death of Kruto, Henry, the son of Gottschalk, the previous Christian prince, appealing to his people's enemies, the Danes and the Saxons, managed to lead an army and defeat his own people in 1093 and become their unwelcome king. Although Henry was a Christian like his father, he too found there was little interest in Christianity amongst his people, but wisely and unlike his father, he didn't force the issue as Gottschalk tried to do. The bishoprics of Mecklenburg, Ratzenburg and Oldenburg were not resurrected. Instead, the church at Lübeck was instructed by Henry to be used as a missionary centre to convert his own people. Henry managed to stay on the throne, dying in 1126, and was succeeded by his son Swentepalk. However, Swentepalk and his brothers were killed by the Wends around 2 years later in 1128 to 29. The Wends at this stage probably hoped for a pagan leader, but the German emperor at the time, Lothair III, imposed a Danish prince on the Slavs called Canute Lavard. In fact, Canute had purchased the title to the Wendish kingdom by offering a fair amount of money to the emperor. Canute, though, made the same mistake as Gottschalk in attempts to impose Christianity, and perhaps unsurprisingly, this triggered another large-scale revolt in 1130, and Canute was killed. The new rulers who replaced him were two brothers, Nyklot and Pribislav, who ruled the Slavs between them from about the year 1130 onwards. Both of these brothers were pagans and therefore acceptable to the Wends, and Prince Nyklot, who seemed to be the senior of the two brothers, immediately stopped the destruction of pagan shrines and expelled the missionaries who were demolishing the temples of his people. And this neatly brings us up to the eve of the Wendish Crusade. Prince Nyklot seemed to be a fairly intelligent man. He had no interest in Christianity and seemed to be fully committed to maintaining the Wendish beliefs and way of life, although some accounts say he was a nominal convert and fully reverted back to his pagan beliefs later in life. That's not the feeling of Helmold, though. Quote, these two men were truculent beasts, intensely hostile to the Christians. In those days, a variety of idolatrous cults and superstitious aberrations grew strong again throughout all of Slavia, was how Helmold of Bozo described the two brothers. From a military angle, Nyklot recognised he was now hemmed in by Christian powers, and his Slav people faced an uphill struggle to retain their religion and culture. But to his credit, Nyklot would not just resist the crusade, but would continue to fight the Saxons till his violent death in a skirmish against Christian forces in 1160. So that was a little bit of history and background on the less than successful project by the church to proselytise amongst the Wends, even with military backing. So what did the bishops and other clergy feel about these large-scale rebellions, lack of progress, and in fact the success of Cruto and the Wends in demolishing churches and cathedrals? Well, they took an even more aggressive and strident stance on suppressing the Slavs. In the year 1108 CE, the Archbishop of Magdeburg, a chap called Adelgot, upped the ante considerably in a famous correspondence called the Magdeburg Letter or Magdeburg Charter. This letter, written either by him or under his aegis, was sent to the king as well as all the men of high rank of Danish and German nobility and others in eastern Saxony, Mainz, Cologne, the county of Flanders and the duchy of Lorraine, as well as the various churchmen in northern Europe. In the letter, he advocated for immediate military measures to be taken against the Wends and for, quote, all greater and lesser men, unquote, to step forward and fight the heathen. The Wendish people, the letter said, quote, have profaned the churches of Christ with idolatry. They have destroyed the altars and they do not hesitate to perpetrate upon us things that the human mind shrinks from hearing, unquote. And it went on to encourage them to emulate the feats of the Crusaders in the First Crusade, but this time in the Baltic. Quote, he who with the arm of his strength gave victory to the Franks, who went from the furthest west against his enemies in the most remote east, let him give to you the will and the power to subdue these nearby and utterly inhuman heathens, and in all things have good success, unquote. Importantly, the bishop viewed a war with the Wends in the same light as the First Crusade against the Muslims to capture Jerusalem, going as far as to equate the Baltic area as their Jerusalem. Quote, declare a holy war, rouse up the strong, arise ye princes against the enemies of Christ, take up the shield, gird yourself valiant men, and let all men of war come. Break forth and come, all ye lovers of Christ and the church, and prepare yourself like the Franks for the liberation of Jerusalem. Our Jerusalem, which from the beginning was free, is made a slave by the cruelty of the heathens, unquote. Now the prime motive was obviously to convert the pagan population. But there was also some very temporal rewards that the bishop offered to prospective crusaders against the Wends. He mentioned the choice and fertile land that awaited conquering by Christians as a financial reward. The area around the Baltic was rich in natural resources, for example, furs, timbers, corn, and fish stocks from its numerous rivers in the Baltic Sea. In other words, there was money and fortunes to be made from a religious war. Quote, these Gentiles are most wicked, but their land is the best, rich in meat, honey, corn, and birds. And if it were well cultivated, none could be compared to it for the wealth of its produce. So say those who know it. And so most renowned Saxon, French, Lorrainers, and Flemings, and conquerors of the world, this is an occasion for you to save your souls, and if you wish it, acquire the best land in which to live. Unquote. Now, the letter was pretty powerful and obviously quite incendiary, but on its own it wasn't sufficient to create the momentum for a crusade proper, although it did generate plenty of interest. And it was followed a few years later in the 1120s by the famous Millstatter Exodus. The Millstatter Exodus was an epic story that became pretty popular around Europe. In the story, the author equates the ideas of Christian armies marching to fight the unbeliever with the biblical story of Exodus, which describes Moses leading his people out of Egypt, followed by the Jews defeating their pagan rivals and conquering Judea. While the Magdeburg letter was aimed more at the Christian nobility and church leaders, the Millstatter Exodus could be said to appeal to the lower classes and the common man. Both, though, had the aim of priming folk with the belief that fighting and destroying non-Christians was a just cause. It's interesting to note that some bishops during this time would personally lead military forces into Wendish territory themselves to demolish pagan temples and desecrate various shrines and sacred places. In 1129, for example, the new Bishop of Magdeburg, St. Norbert, who also advocated the use of force to convert the pagans, would personally lead a military expedition to capture the pagan city of Havelberg, which he called the seat of iniquity, being populated as it was with so many pagan temples. After the city was taken, a church was consecrated, and no doubt the citizens asked to convert. However, the city was retaken shortly later by the Wends in 1136, and the church which St. Norbert built was razed to the ground. And attacks also came from further north. The Danes also had their eyes on fresh territory to their east, as well as making converts. In 1136, the same year St. Norbert attacked Havelberg, the Danes attacked the island of Rugia under Eric II and forced the Rani, the people who lived on the island, to convert at the point of the sword. However, the Danes couldn't occupy the island permanently, and the Rani quickly went back to worshipping their own deities as soon as the Danish army left. But during the 11th and 12th century, the destruction of pagan shrines in Slavic lands became more frequent. Examples of these activities are fairly extensive and happened all along the Baltic coast and not just in Wendish territory. A well-known holy grove in Sorbian lands, for instance, was razed to the ground at the order of Bishop Wigbert of Merseburg at the turn of the 11th century. In Pomerania, a Spanish missionary by the name of Bishop Bernard proceeded to destroy a pagan shrine at the city of Wollin in 1123. Luckily for him, he was helped to escape by the pagan priests, otherwise he would have been torn to shreds by the locals. And in Wagria, a Bishop Gerald of Lübeck also destroyed a pagan shrine dedicated to the god Prove, as well as its enclosure in a sacred grove around 1150 CE. So these kind of acts of religious vandalism were becoming fairly common all around the Baltic coast. And as you can see, the military and religious pressure wasn't just falling on the Wends at this time, but also their pagan neighbours to the east, the Pomeranians. And that was because the Polish king Boleslav III had started a campaign to both subjugate and convert the Pomeranian people to his north. Ebo describes the Polish Christian duke in his work. Quote, for Duke Boleslav, who was distinguished for his piety and for his devotion to God and his worshippers, was deservedly harsh and implacable towards idolaters, and he was warned year after year to raise a large army and to devastate the land of the pagans so that through fear of the sword they might be brought into subjection to the Christian faith, unquote. Boleslav would end up capturing the pagan city of Stettin in 1121, although he would have little luck converting the Pomeranians at this time. To help the process, he drafted in Bishop Otto of Bamberg, a former chaplain at the Polish court, to assist in the conversion. Boleslav would continue his onslaught from the years 1124 to 1139, and after these bloody wars and after receiving savage threats of another invasion, the Pomeranian princes decided they'd had enough and agreed to accept Christianity. Following this, all the temples and holy places of the Pomeranians were razed to the ground by incoming German missionaries, and clerics and churches built over their sites. And so the largely nominal as yet conversion of Pomerania could be said to have begun around 1125 to 27. And in 1127, the famous temple to the Pomeranian god Triglav was destroyed in Stettin, and the Bishop Otto of Bamberg ordered all the money of the temple treasury to be distributed to the people in an effort to placate them to an extent. However, he would receive much hostility as he travelled on to Wallin in 1127 to carry out similar work. The third main reason, and which would also exacerbate matters, was the slow but inexorable occupation of Slavic lands by German settlers. After the Battle of Lenzen had reduced the Wends to subordinate status, and especially during the 11th and early 12th century, the prospect of fresh land which could be seized from the local Slavs drew many Saxon farmers and peasants from west of the Elbe River into Wendish lands, and this wasn't helped by the fact that the population density in Eastern Europe was much less compared to heavily populated Western Europe, so there was a strong impulse to migrate to the east. This migration of primarily German settlers, but also Frankish and Danish people to occupy Slav territory would later be called the Drang nach Osten by the Germans, which translates to the drive to the east. And this migration was something both the Saxon nobility and aristocracy and the church encouraged, as more German settlers in newly conquered territories meant more tax revenue for the nobles and translated to larger tithes for the church as more ground was cultivated. It's important to remember tithes to the church were obligatory in those days. So, over time, more and more German Saxons began arbitrarily crossing the Elbe River frontier and moving into and settling in Slavic lands, much to the chagrin of the Slavs who were either dispossessed or became second-class citizens. Helmold describes entire border areas with the Wends being taken over by Saxon settlers dispossessing the Wendish people by the middle of the 12th century. Quote, all the country of the Slavs, beginning at the Ida and extending between the Baltic Sea and the Elbe River in a most lengthy sweep to Schwerin, a region once feared for its ambuscades and almost deserted, was now, through the help of God, all made, as it were, into one colony of Saxons. And cities and villages grew up there, and churches were built, and the number of ministers of Christ multiplied. All the land of the Obotrites and the neighbouring regions which belonged to the realm of the Abotrites had been wholly reduced to a solitude through unremitting warfare. If there were any last remnants of Slavs remaining, they were, on account of the want of grain and the desolation of the fields, so reduced by hunger that they had to flee together to the Pomeranians and to the Danes, who, showing them no mercy, sold them to the Poles, Sorbs and Bohemians. The work of God thus increased in the land of Vagria, and the Count and the Bishop of Oldenburg cooperated one with the other. About this time, the Count rebuilt the stronghold at Plon and made there a city and marketplace. The Slavs who lived in the villages round about withdrew, and Saxons came and dwelt there, and the Slavs little by little failed in the land. Unquote. And he described the gradual demographic catastrophe and possible extinction facing the Wends as they contemplated military defeat and territorial takeover by Christian settlers from the west. Quote, in the end, as the Slavs gradually decreased in number, he sent to Utrecht and to places lying on the Rhine, to those, moreover, who live by the ocean and suffer the violence of the sea, to wit, Hollanders, Zealanders, Flemings, and he brought large numbers of them and had them live in the strongholds and villages of the Slavs. Now, because God gave plentiful aid and victory to our Duke and to the other princes, the Slavs have been everywhere crushed and driven out. A people strong and without number have come from the bounds of the ocean and taken possession of the territories of the Slavs. They have built cities and churches and have grown in riches beyond all estimation. Unquote. These new settlers took over villages and settlements that the disappearing Wends were leaving behind. In addition, wooden palisades and defences were built to solidify their hold on the territory, making them much harder to displace should another Slav uprising take place. So that was the background, the politics, the military conflicts, and the role of the church and clergy up to the middle of the 12th century, which all added up to make a rather precarious situation for the pagan Slavs on what would be the eve of the Second Crusade, and which all laid the groundwork for the Wendish Crusade as well. All a full-blooded attack on the Wends required was a trigger from a major event, and that would come with news reaching Europe of the fall of the Crusader city of Edessa in the Middle East. And we'll deal with that in part 2 of this story and what happened to the Wends in the crusade against them that followed this news. By the way, a quick word on sources. If you'd like to read up the various accounts we have on the Wends and the Wendish Crusade by yourself, here's a list of the more important medieval and contemporary sources we have that still survive from those times and which were used in the making of this video. The most important in terms of the Crusade are the later ones from Adam of Bremen, Helmold of Bozo, and Saxo Grammaticus, but they all provide pretty fascinating glimpses into the fractious relations between Christian Saxons and pagan Wends over the centuries. And that's it. Thanks for watching if you've made it this far on what turned out to be a fairly longish video. And a quick reminder, if you like these kind of videos, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit the like and subscribe buttons. And I hope to see you in part 2 of this video.